The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Captain Sarah Mitchell walked through the corridors of Building 7. Her combat boots echoed against the polished concrete floors, each step carrying the weight of a woman who had fought her way through 15 years of military service. At 38, Sarah had earned her rank through dedication, countless sleepless nights, and an unwavering commitment to protecting her country. Sarah served as the base's logistics coordinator, a position that required her to oversee supply chains, equipment distribution, and resource allocation for over 3,000 personnel stationed at Fort Harrison. Her office overlooked the main training grounds, where young recruits learned the fundamentals of military discipline. She took pride in ensuring these soldiers had everything they needed to succeed. The base had been her home for the past 5 years. She knew every corner, every shortcut, and every person who mattered. Her reputation was spotless. Colleagues respected her efficiency, subordinates admired her fairness, and superiors valued her results. Sarah had always believed that hard work and integrity would carry her through any challenge the military could present. 3 men had recently arrived at Fort Harrison, each carrying the rank of general and wielding influence that extended far beyond the base's boundaries. General Marcus Webb commanded the Northeastern Division and was known for his aggressive expansion policies. His silver hair and piercing blue eyes masked a cunning mind that calculated every move 3 steps ahead. Webb had built his career on strategic alliances and wasn't afraid to eliminate obstacles that stood in his way. General Robert Kane controlled supply operations across multiple bases and held significant sway over resource distribution. His broad shoulders and commanding presence intimidated most people he encountered. Kane had earned his position through a combination of military excellence and political maneuvering. Behind his decorated uniform lay a man who understood that information was the most valuable currency in the armed forces. General David Torres overseen intelligence operations and maintained extensive networks throughout the military hierarchy. His quiet demeanor and analytical approach to problems made him perhaps the most dangerous of the 3. Torres rarely spoke unless his words could achieve a specific objective. His influence reached into the highest levels of government, and few people crossed him without facing consequences. The 3 generals had arrived under the pretense of conducting a routine inspection and evaluation of base operations. However, their extended stay and private meetings suggested a different agenda. They occupied the officers' quarters in the administrative building and held daily conferences that excluded most of the base's regular command structure. Sarah first noticed something unusual when supply requisitions began arriving with irregular approval codes. Shipments that should have taken weeks to process were being expedited without proper documentation. Equipment meant for training exercises was being redirected to unmarked vehicles that left the base during night hours. The patterns didn't match any standard military procedure she had encountered in her career. Her training had taught her to pay attention to details that others might overlook. Small discrepancies in inventory reports, unusual communication protocols, and changes in personnel assignments all pointed toward something significant happening behind closed doors. Sarah began keeping detailed records of these anomalies, documenting dates, times, and the people involved in each irregular transaction. The base's atmosphere had shifted since the general's arrival. Conversations stopped when they entered rooms, and longtime staff members seemed nervous during routine interactions. Sarah noticed that several junior officers who had previously been outspoken about base policies had become unusually quiet. The change was subtle, but unmistakable to someone who had spent years observing military culture. During a staff meeting in late October, General Webb announced new security protocols that would restrict access to certain areas of the base. He explained that these measures were necessary to protect sensitive operations and maintain operational security. The announcement came without prior discussion with the base's regular command structure, which violated standard procedures for implementing policy changes. Sarah raised her hand during the meeting to ask about the timeline for implementing these changes and how they would affect daily operations. General Webb's response was curt and dismissive, suggesting that logistics coordinators should focus on their assigned duties rather than questioning policy decisions. The room fell silent, and Sarah felt the weight of three generals' attention focused entirely on her. After the meeting, several colleagues approached Sarah privately to express their concerns about the new restrictions. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, who had worked with Sarah for 3 years, mentioned that he had seen unmarked trucks leaving the base with equipment that wasn't logged in any official records. Lieutenant Thompson shared that she had been told to stop asking questions about supply discrepancies that she had previously been responsible for investigating. Sarah realized that she had stumbled onto something much larger than routine policy changes. The three generals weren't conducting a standard inspection. They were implementing a coordinated operation that circumvented normal military oversight. Her position as logistics coordinator gave her access to information that could expose whatever they were trying to hide. That evening, Sarah stayed late in her office to review shipping manifests and supply records from the past month. The patterns became clearer as she compared official documentation with her personal observations. Expensive equipment was being requisitioned using emergency protocols, then diverted to locations that weren't listed in any standard military database. The financial value of these irregularities totaled millions of dollars. As she prepared to leave her office around 9 o'clock, Sarah heard footsteps in the hallway outside. The administrative building was normally empty at this hour, except for security personnel making their rounds. She quickly saved her files and locked her computer before gathering the printed documents she had been reviewing. General Torres appeared in her doorway just as she was putting on her jacket. His presence startled her, but she maintained her composure as he stepped into the office without invitation. He asked what she was working on so late, and Sarah explained that she was catching up on routine paperwork. Torres nodded slowly, his eyes scanning her desk and noting the papers in her hand. The conversation that followed would replay in Sarah's mind countless times over the coming weeks. Torres spoke in measured tones about the importance of discretion in military operations and the dangers that could result from misunderstanding complex situations. He emphasized that some information required careful handling and that jumping to conclusions could have serious consequences for everyone involved. Sarah assured him that she understood the importance of following proper protocols and maintaining security. However, Torres's visit felt more like a warning than a casual conversation. After he left, she realized that her investigation had not gone unnoticed by the three generals, who now controlled significant aspects of the base's operations. The next morning brought a memorandum announcing that Captain Sarah Mitchell would be transferred to a new assignment effective immediately. The orders came without explanation and bypassed the normal channels for personnel decisions. Sarah's 15 years of exemplary service and her current responsibilities were apparently irrelevant to the generals who had decided her fate overnight. Sarah requested a meeting with the base commander to discuss the transfer, but was informed that Colonel Harris was unavailable and that all personnel decisions were now being handled directly by the visiting generals. This represented a complete breakdown of normal military hierarchy and confirmed Sarah's suspicions that something illegal was taking place. She spent her final day at Fort Harrison, trying to document everything she had discovered and ensure that her replacement would have access to the information needed to continue normal operations. However, when she arrived at her office that morning, she found that her computer access had been revoked and her files were no longer available through the network. The printed documents she had reviewed the previous evening were missing from her desk, and the filing cabinets that contained backup copies had been sealed with official tamper-evident tape. Sarah realized that the three generals had moved quickly to eliminate any evidence of their activities and remove the person most likely to expose their operation. As she cleared out her personal belongings, Sarah made a decision that would change the trajectory of her life. She had sworn an oath to protect and defend her country, and that oath included protecting it from threats that came from within the military itself. The three generals might have removed her from the base, but they hadn't eliminated her knowledge of what they were doing. That afternoon, as Sarah prepared to leave Fort Harrison for the last time, she encountered General Webb near the main gate. He stopped her to express his regrets about her transfer and to wish her success in her new assignment. The conversation was cordial on the surface, but Webb's words carried an unmistakable undertone of threat. He mentioned that military careers could be fragile things and that certain types of accusations could destroy not only the person making them but also their families and friends. Webb reminded Sarah that she had a comfortable pension to look forward to, and a reputation worth protecting. The implication was clear. Silence would be rewarded, while speaking out would bring consequences. Sarah maintained her professional demeanor throughout the conversation, but inside she was calculating her next moves. The three generals controlled significant resources and influence, but they had made one crucial mistake. They had underestimated a woman who had spent 15 years learning how to fight battles that others thought she couldn't win. As she drove away from Fort Harrison that evening, Sarah looked in her rearview mirror at the base where she had dedicated 5 years of her life. The flags still flew proudly above the main buildings, and the young recruits continued their training as if nothing had changed. But Sarah knew that something rotten had taken root in a place that was supposed to represent honor and service. The three generals had won the first round by removing her from the base and eliminating her access to evidence. However, Sarah possessed something they couldn't confiscate: her memory, her training, and her determination to expose the truth. The real battle was just beginning, and she intended to make sure that the right side would ultimately prevail. The road ahead would test everything she had learned about courage, persistence, and the price of standing up for what was right. But as Sarah drove into an uncertain future, she carried with her the conviction that some fights were worth any sacrifice. The three generals might control Fort Harrison, but they didn't control her. Sarah's new assignment took her to a small administrative office in downtown Washington, processing veteran benefits claims. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as she sat at a metal desk that was half the size of what she had commanded at Fort Harrison. Her supervisor, a civilian administrator named Janet Collins, treated her with polite indifference and seemed surprised that someone with Sarah's rank had been assigned to such routine work. The transition was jarring. Instead of coordinating million-dollar supply operations and managing logistics for thousands of personnel, Sarah now spent her days reviewing medical records and processing paperwork for discharged veterans. The work was important, but it felt like professional exile. Every morning, as she walked into the bland government building, she was reminded of how quickly a military career could be derailed. During her lunch breaks, Sarah began visiting the Library of Congress to research military procurement procedures and federal regulations governing base operations. She used her military identification to access databases that contained information about supply chain management and oversight protocols. Her goal was to understand exactly which laws the three generals had violated and how their operation had circumvented normal safeguards. The research revealed that military bases were required to maintain detailed records of all equipment transfers, and that any deviation from standard procedures had to be approved through multiple levels of command. The emergency protocols that had been used to expedite shipments at Fort Harrison were only supposed to be implemented during actual combat situations or natural disasters. None of those conditions had existed during the time period Sarah had observed. 3 weeks into her new assignment, Sarah received an unexpected phone call at her apartment. The voice on the other end identified himself as Agent Michael Chen from the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. He explained that his office had received an anonymous tip about irregularities at Fort Harrison and wanted to discuss her observations with someone who had worked there recently. Sarah agreed to meet Agent Chen at a coffee shop near the Capitol building the following evening. She arrived 30 minutes early and chose a table near the back where they could talk without being overheard. Chen arrived precisely on time. A tall man with dark hair and an earnest expression that suggested he took his job seriously. He showed her his credentials and explained that his office investigated allegations of fraud and corruption within the military. During their 2-hour conversation, Sarah provided detailed information about the supply irregularities she had observed, the unusual behavior of the three generals, and the circumstances surrounding her sudden transfer. Chen took extensive notes and asked specific questions about dates, dollar amounts, and the people involved in each incident. His knowledge of military procedures convinced Sarah that he was legitimate and capable of pursuing the matter properly. Agent Chen explained that investigating high-ranking military officers required substantial evidence and that accusations without proof could destroy careers and undermine legitimate operations. He asked Sarah if she would be willing to work with his office to gather additional information that could support a formal investigation. The request was voluntary, but Chen emphasized that her inside knowledge could be crucial to exposing potential criminal activity. Sarah understood the risks involved in cooperating with an inspector general investigation. Military careers had been destroyed by retaliation against whistleblowers, and the three generals clearly had enough influence to make life difficult for anyone who opposed them. However, her oath as an officer included a responsibility to report misconduct, and she couldn't ignore what she had witnessed at Fort Harrison. Over the following weeks, Sarah met regularly with Agent Chen to provide information and discuss strategies for gathering evidence. He explained that his office had begun monitoring financial records related to Fort Harrison and had identified several transactions that appeared to violate federal procurement regulations. The evidence was circumstantial, but it supported Sarah's observations and suggested that a systematic operation was taking place. Agent Chen also revealed that Sarah wasn't the first person to report concerns about the three generals. Two other officers from different bases had contacted the Inspector General's office with similar allegations about supply irregularities and unauthorized equipment transfers. The pattern suggested that the operation extended beyond Fort Harrison and involved multiple military installations. The investigation required patience and careful documentation. Agent Chen explained that they needed to build a case that would withstand scrutiny from defense attorneys and that could result in criminal charges if the evidence supported that level of action. This meant gathering financial records, identifying witnesses, and establishing clear connections between the general's actions and violations of federal law. During this period, Sarah began receiving phone calls at odd hours, where the caller would hang up immediately when she answered. Her apartment mailbox was tampered with, and she noticed unfamiliar vehicles parked outside her building. The harassment was subtle, but persistent, clearly designed to make her feel watched and vulnerable. She reported these incidents to Agent Chen, who arranged for security measures to protect her while the investigation continued. Sarah's work at the Veterans Benefits Office provided unexpected assistance to the investigation. Her access to military personnel databases allowed her to research the backgrounds and assignments of people who had worked with the three generals at various bases. This information helped Agent Chen's team identify potential witnesses and understand the scope of the operation they were investigating. One evening in December, Agent Chen called Sarah with urgent news. A financial analyst working for his office had discovered that equipment supposedly transferred to Fort Harrison was actually being sold to private contractors at prices significantly below market value. The buyers were shell companies that had connections to businesses owned by relatives of the three generals. This represented clear evidence of corruption and fraud that could result in criminal charges. The discovery energized the investigation team, but it also increased the danger for everyone involved. Agent Chen warned Sarah that the three generals would likely escalate their efforts to intimidate witnesses once they realized that a formal investigation was uncovering concrete evidence of their crimes. He offered to arrange protective custody, but Sarah declined, preferring to maintain her normal routine while taking additional security precautions. Sarah's determination to see the investigation through was strengthened by letters she received from former colleagues at Fort Harrison. Master Sergeant Rodriguez wrote to tell her that morale at the base had deteriorated significantly since her departure, and that several good officers had requested transfers rather than work under the new command structure. Lieutenant Thompson mentioned that questions about supply discrepancies were now strictly forbidden, and that personnel who raised concerns faced immediate disciplinary action. The three generals had consolidated their control over Fort Harrison, but their heavy-handed approach was creating additional witnesses to their misconduct. Agent Chen's team began receiving anonymous tips from base personnel who were frustrated by the corruption they witnessed, but afraid to speak out openly. These tips provided valuable leads that helped investigators trace the flow of stolen equipment and identify additional victims of the fraud scheme. In January, the investigation reached a critical milestone when Agent Chen's team obtained a federal search warrant for the financial records of the shell companies that had been purchasing military equipment. The warrant was based on evidence that Sarah had helped gather, including detailed documentation of supply irregularities and testimony from witnesses who had observed the unauthorized transfers. The search revealed extensive records showing that millions of dollars worth of military equipment had been sold to private buyers over a period of 18 months. The three generals had used their positions to authorize emergency transfers, then diverted the equipment to companies they controlled or that paid them substantial commissions. The scheme had generated enormous profits, while depriving military units of resources they needed for training and operations. Agent Chen called Sarah on the day the search warrants were executed to inform her that the investigation had gathered enough evidence to support criminal charges against all three generals. Federal prosecutors were reviewing the case and would likely file indictments within the next few weeks. Sarah's cooperation had been essential to building the case, and her courage in coming forward had made it possible to expose a fraud scheme that had affected multiple military bases. However, Agent Chen also warned that the most dangerous phase of the investigation was just beginning. Once the indictments were announced, the three generals would face decades in prison and would have nothing to lose by retaliating against the people who had exposed them. Sarah would need to remain vigilant and continue following security protocols until the case was resolved through the court system. Sarah felt a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension as she absorbed this news. The investigation had vindicated her decision to report the misconduct she had observed, and the evidence clearly showed that her concerns had been justified. The three generals who had seemed so powerful when they controlled Fort Harrison would soon face the consequences of their actions in federal court. But Sarah also understood that powerful people rarely accepted defeat gracefully, especially when facing the loss of their freedom and reputation. The three generals had already demonstrated their willingness to intimidate and threaten anyone who opposed them. With criminal charges pending, they might escalate to more serious forms of retaliation. As she prepared for whatever challenges lay ahead, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. 9 months earlier, she had been a respected logistics coordinator focused on managing supply operations for a major military base. Now she was the key witness in a federal fraud investigation that would determine whether justice prevailed over corruption within the military she had served for 15 years. The road ahead would test her resolve in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The three generals still wielded considerable influence and resources, and they had every incentive to prevent her testimony from reaching a courtroom. But Sarah had already proven that integrity and determination could overcome intimidation and threats. The final confrontation was approaching, and she intended to be ready for whatever it might bring. The federal courthouse in downtown Washington buzzed with activity as reporters gathered outside for what the media was calling the biggest military corruption trial in decades. Sarah Mitchell adjusted her dress uniform one final time before entering the building where she would testify against the three generals who had once seemed untouchable. The weight of her service ribbons reminded her of the oath she had taken 15 years earlier to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Agent Chen met Sarah at the security checkpoint and escorted her through the crowded hallways to the witness preparation room. Federal prosecutor Amanda Rodriguez reviewed the key points of Sarah's testimony one final time, emphasizing the importance of presenting facts clearly and answering only the questions that were asked. The prosecution's case relied heavily on Sarah's first-hand observations and her documentation of the supply irregularities that had first exposed the fraud scheme. The courtroom was packed when Sarah was called to testify. She walked confidently to the witness stand, raised her right hand, and swore to tell the truth before taking her seat. The three generals sat at the defense table in civilian suits, their military bearing still evident despite their changed circumstances. General Webb stared directly at her with the same calculating expression she remembered from their final conversation at Fort Harrison. Prosecutor Rodriguez began with questions about Sarah's military background and her role as logistics coordinator at Fort Harrison. Sarah described her responsibilities for managing supply operations and her training in recognizing irregularities in procurement procedures. Her 15 years of exemplary service established her credibility and expertise in the areas central to the case. The prosecutor then guided Sarah through a detailed account of the events she had observed during the three generals' stay at Fort Harrison. Sarah described the unauthorized equipment transfers, the use of emergency protocols during routine operations, and the millions of dollars worth of military property that had been diverted to private buyers. Her testimony was precise and professional, supported by documentation she had carefully preserved despite attempts to confiscate her records. General Webb's defense attorney began the cross-examination by questioning Sarah's motivations for coming forward with her allegations. He suggested that she was bitter about her transfer from Fort Harrison and was seeking revenge against officers who had legitimately questioned her performance. The attorney's aggressive approach was designed to undermine Sarah's credibility and portray her as a disgruntled employee making false accusations. Sarah remained calm throughout the hostile questioning, responding to each attack with facts and documentation. She explained that her transfer had come without warning and without any prior indication of performance problems. Her personnel file, introduced as evidence, showed consistent, excellent ratings and commendations throughout her career. The defense attorney's tactics appeared to backfire as Sarah's composure highlighted the weakness of their arguments. The prosecution called several other witnesses who corroborated Sarah's observations and provided additional evidence of the general's misconduct. Master Sergeant Rodriguez testified about being ordered to stop asking questions about supply discrepancies. Lieutenant Thompson described the atmosphere of fear and intimidation that had developed at Fort Harrison after the general's arrival. A financial analyst explained how the shell companies had been used to convert stolen military equipment into personal profits. Agent Chen's testimony detailed the investigation process and the evidence that had been gathered through search warrants and financial analysis. He described how Sarah's initial report had provided the foundation for a comprehensive investigation that ultimately revealed fraud totaling over $50 million. The agent's professional presentation of the evidence demonstrated that the prosecution's case was based on solid investigative work rather than speculation or personal grievances. The defense strategy focused on portraying the three generals as dedicated officers who had been carrying out classified operations that required flexibility in normal procedures. Their attorneys argued that the equipment transfers were authorized under emergency protocols and that any irregularities in documentation were due to the sensitive nature of the operations involved. This argument required the jury to believe that national security justified bypassing standard oversight procedures. However, the prosecution systematically dismantled this defense by showing that no legitimate military operation required the sale of equipment to private companies owned by the general's relatives. Expert witnesses testified that the emergency protocols cited by the defense were only applicable during actual combat situations or natural disasters. Financial records showed that the proceeds from equipment sales had gone directly to personal bank accounts rather than supporting any military objective. The trial lasted 3 weeks, with each day bringing new revelations about the scope and duration of the fraud scheme. Sarah attended every session, providing support to other witnesses and ensuring that the prosecution team had access to her detailed knowledge of military procedures. Her presence in the courtroom also sent a clear message that she remained committed to seeing the case through to its conclusion. During the final week of trial, the defense made a last desperate attempt to discredit Sarah's testimony. General Torres's attorney introduced evidence suggesting that Sarah had been romantically involved with a junior officer at Fort Harrison and had used her position to show favoritism in supply allocations. The accusation was completely fabricated, but it forced the prosecution to spend valuable time refuting claims that had no bearing on the fraud charges. Sarah testified again to address these false allegations directly. She provided documentation showing that her professional relationships had always maintained appropriate boundaries and that her decisions had been based solely on operational requirements. Several character witnesses testified about her integrity and professionalism throughout her career. The defense's attack on her personal life only reinforced the prosecution's argument that the generals would stop at nothing to avoid accountability. On the evening before closing arguments, Sarah received a phone call from an unknown number. The voice belonged to General Webb, who offered her a substantial sum of money to recant her testimony and claim that she had misunderstood the operations she had observed. He suggested that her military pension could be increased and that she could receive a prestigious assignment if she cooperated with his request. Sarah recorded the conversation on her phone and immediately contacted Agent Chen and the prosecution team. Webb's attempt to bribe a witness constituted additional criminal behavior and demonstrated that he remained willing to break the law even while facing trial for previous crimes. The recording was presented to the court the following morning and resulted in additional charges against Webb for witness tampering. The prosecution's closing argument emphasized that the case was about honor, integrity, and the duty of military officers to serve their country rather than enriching themselves. Prosecutor Rodriguez reminded the jury that Sarah Mitchell had risked her career and her safety to expose corruption that was stealing resources from the men and women who defended America. The evidence showed clearly that the three generals had betrayed their oath and violated the trust placed in them by the American people. The defense's closing argument was a final attempt to portray the generals as patriotic officers who had been unfairly targeted by overzealous investigators and disgruntled subordinates. However, their argument could not overcome the overwhelming evidence of financial fraud and the clear paper trail showing how military equipment had been converted into personal profits. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on all counts against all 3 defendants. General Webb was convicted of fraud, conspiracy, and witness tampering. Generals Kane and Torres were convicted of fraud and conspiracy. The maximum sentences they faced totaled several decades in federal prison, effectively ending their military careers and their freedom. Judge Patricia Morrison sentenced each general to lengthy prison terms, emphasizing that their high rank and positions of trust made their crimes particularly serious. She noted that military officers were held to higher standards of conduct and that their betrayal of those standards had damaged the reputation of the entire armed forces. The sentences sent a clear message that corruption would not be tolerated regardless of rank or influence. Sarah sat in the courtroom as the sentences were announced, feeling a mixture of relief and satisfaction. The 3 generals who had seemed so powerful 18 months earlier were now being led away in handcuffs to begin their prison sentences. Justice had prevailed, but the cost had been enormous for everyone involved. Following the trial, Sarah was reassigned to a position at the Pentagon, where her experience and integrity were valued by superiors who understood the courage she had demonstrated. Her new role involved developing improved oversight procedures to prevent the type of fraud that had occurred at Fort Harrison. The assignment was both a recognition of her contributions and an opportunity to help protect the military from future corruption. The Fort Harrison investigation led to broader reforms in military procurement procedures and strengthened oversight of equipment transfers between bases. Sarah's willingness to report misconduct despite personal risk had exposed weaknesses in the system that allowed corrupt officers to operate without detection. Her actions ultimately benefited every honest service member by helping to ensure that military resources would be used for their intended purposes. Sarah received several commendations for her role in exposing the fraud, including a Defense Distinguished Service Medal for exceptionally meritorious service to the United States. However, she understood that the real victory was not the recognition she received, but the knowledge that she had fulfilled her duty to protect the institution she had served for 15 years. Years later, Sarah would look back on this period as a defining moment in her career and her life. The decision to report the misconduct she had observed at Fort Harrison had cost her a comfortable position and subjected her to months of intimidation and harassment. But it had also proven that individual integrity could overcome institutional corruption, and that standing up for the truth was worth any personal sacrifice. The 3 generals had controlled Fort Harrison for only a few months, but their impact had been devastating for morale and operational effectiveness. Sarah's courage in exposing their crimes had restored accountability and sent a message that no one was above the law, regardless of rank or influence. The military she loved had been damaged by their betrayal, but it had also been strengthened by the proof that good people would fight to protect it. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Pentagon courtyard as Sarah walked to her office, her combat boots echoing against the concrete with the same rhythm that had carried her through 15 years of military service. She had learned that sometimes the most important battles were fought not on distant battlefields, but in the halls of power where integrity and corruption struggled for control of the institutions that protected American democracy.